Part 2. Jason stepped into the office, the door clicking shut behind him with a finality that made his skin prickle. The room was dimly lit, the blinds drawn just enough to allow a sliver of light to slice across the desk. Harris sat behind it, his hands steepled in front of him, eyes narrowed as though he were trying to assess Jason without speaking a word. Jason took a seat across from him, the weight of the case already pressing down on his chest. The last few moments had been a blur, his conversation with Ryan, the sudden call from Harris, the realization that something far bigger than a traffic stop was unfolding in front of him. He wasn't sure if he was ready to dive into this. But he didn't have a choice. "Here's what we know," Harris said, his voice clipped and professional. "The leaks are tied to high-profile cases that have been classified, Jason. Someone in this department has been feeding sensitive information to outside sources. And it's not just one case, it's been ongoing for months." Jason leaned forward, his elbows resting on the desk as his mind raced. "Do we know who?" "Not yet," Harris replied. "But the leaks have been traced back to a very specific group. People who have had access to these cases. We're talking about people in the highest levels of this department." Jason's stomach turned. The implications of that were heavy, far heavier than just a breach of protocol or a single case being compromised. This was corruption. This was systemic failure, and it ran deeper than he could imagine. Harris exhaled sharply. "This has the potential to destroy everything we've worked for, Jason. It's not just about the department's reputation, it's about the integrity of the law itself. People's lives are at risk." Jason's fingers drummed against the edge of the table, his mind whirring with the sudden flood of information. "Do we have any suspects?" Harris hesitated, his eyes flickering toward the file on his desk. "That's the tricky part. We have some leads, but no concrete evidence. There are rumors, whispers. And those whispers lead to a group of people with a lot to lose. We've got to tread carefully." Jason felt the weight of those words, the pressure mounting with each passing second. He had been in internal affairs long enough to understand how these things worked, how the higher up you went, the more complicated everything became. But this? This was different. This was personal. Jason stood up, pacing slowly in the small office, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. His thoughts were scattered, fragmented. Could this be the result of what he'd seen in Ryan's eyes earlier? Had the officer's actions been a result of a broken system, one where prejudice ran so deep that it had reached into the very core of the department? Or was this just another way the system was rigged to benefit those who had always held power? "I can't just walk in and start accusing people, Harris," Jason said, his voice low. "We don't have enough. This is dangerous. If this goes wrong, it could get out of hand fast." Harris nodded, his gaze sharp. "I know. But we don't have a choice. We're already behind. We have to move quickly, before the leaks cause even more damage." Jason felt his pulse quicken. The path ahead was murky, filled with uncertainty. His mind kept circling back to Ryan, to that moment on the street. The officer had been taken aback when he realized who Jason was. Maybe that had been a wake-up call for Ryan, maybe not. But the question kept gnawing at him, was this officer part of something larger? Was the corruption so pervasive that even the people on the ground, people like Ryan, were affected by it? Jason rubbed the back of his neck, frustration building in his chest. "I don't know where to start. We can't just send someone to ask around. This kind of thing doesn't happen overnight." "No," Harris agreed. "It's been building for a long time. But I'm counting on you, Jason. You've got the experience to find the cracks. I need you to follow the leads. It's the only way." Jason met Harris's gaze, feeling the weight of his words settle in. "I'll do it," he said, his voice firm. "But this has to be done carefully. We can't afford to make mistakes." Harris nodded, his expression unreadable. "I'll have the files sent to your office. Get to work." Jason walked out of the office and into the quiet hallway, the silence of the building pressing in around him. His mind was already racing, the pieces of the puzzle shifting in his mind as he tried to make sense of the new reality. He had never felt so alone. The fight had always been about doing the right thing, about holding people accountable. But now, it felt like the system itself was the enemy. He wasn't just fighting against the prejudices of one officer. No, now he was fighting against an entire network of corruption, one that stretched deeper than he could have imagined. And somewhere in that web, the answer was waiting. He just had to find it. Jason made his way to his office, the door clicking shut behind him as he sat down at his desk. The files were already there, neatly stacked and ready to be opened. He opened the first one, scanning the contents quickly, but nothing jumped out at him. Another case, another name, another person whose life had been destroyed because someone with power had abused it. He flipped through the pages, his fingers brushing over the words, searching for something that didn't belong. And then, halfway through the stack, he found it. A name. Ryan Brooks. Jason froze, the name flashing in front of him like a neon sign. His heart skipped a beat, and for a moment, he couldn't breathe. This couldn't be a coincidence. Ryan. The same officer. The one who had stopped him on the street. The one who had made assumptions based on nothing but the color of his skin. The one who had been so quick to judge him, to treat him as a threat. And now, here he was. In the files. Connected to the leaks. Jason leaned back in his chair, a rush of adrenaline coursing through his veins. This was bigger than he thought. Far bigger. If you're feeling the heat building in this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. We're diving deeper into the investigation, and you won't want to miss what happens next. Stay tuned for more twists. Jason's heart pounded in his chest as he stared at the name on the file. Ryan Brooks. The officer who had pulled him over just hours earlier. The officer who had stood there, flustered and guilty, as Jason had confronted him about his assumptions. The officer who was now, in some twisted way, tangled up in the very thing Jason had been sent to uncover. For a moment, Jason couldn't breathe. The air in the room felt thick, oppressive, like it was pushing against him from all sides. He leaned back in his chair, trying to steady his thoughts, to make sense of the situation. His fingers drummed absent-mindedly on the desk, his mind racing through 1,000 possibilities. Could Ryan really be involved in the leaks? Was it just a coincidence, or had Jason somehow stumbled into something much larger than he could have imagined? He grabbed the file, his hands shaking slightly as he flipped through the pages. The evidence was damning. Names. Dates. Cases that had been compromised. And right there in the middle of it all, Ryan Brooks. His name was attached to several of the most sensitive cases. Jason's stomach twisted with disbelief. How had this happened? How had someone like Ryan, someone who seemed so eager to do his job, become part of something so insidious? Jason's mind couldn't help but go back to their earlier conversation on the street. He had seen the officer's hesitation, his uncertainty. Had Ryan been just as unaware of the deeper corruption in the department as Jason had been? Jason's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of his phone vibrating on his desk. He glanced at the screen. It was an unknown number. He hesitated, unsure whether to answer. But something about the situation, the tension in the air, made him pick up the phone anyway. "Hello?" he answered, his voice tight. There was a long pause on the other end before a low voice responded. "Jason Reed?" Jason's pulse quickened. "Who's this?" "It's Officer Ryan Brooks," the voice said, his tone cautious, almost apologetic. I need to talk to you. In person." Jason's heart skipped a beat. He wasn't sure what to make of this. Ryan had never called him before, and now, just hours after their encounter, here he was, reaching out. Jason's mind whirled with questions. Was this a trap? Or was this Ryan trying to come clean? I'm listening, Jason said slowly, leaning forward in his chair, his fingers gripping the edge of the desk. I know what you saw, Ryan said, his voice barely above a whisper. The file. My name. Look, I didn't. Ryan, Jason interrupted, his voice sharp. I'm looking at it right now. The leaks. Your name's all over them. What the hell is going on? There was a long silence, and Jason could practically hear Ryan's breath on the other end of the line. Finally, Ryan spoke again, his voice shaky. I didn't mean for this to happen. It wasn't supposed to go this far. I didn't know what I was getting into. Jason could feel the officer's words hanging in the air like a confession, but he couldn't make sense of them. What are you talking about? Jason demanded. You're involved in these leaks. You've been feeding information to people who are trying to destroy this department. You've been putting people's lives at risk. Do you even realize what you're doing? Ryan let out a long, drawn-out sigh, and for the first time, his voice cracked. I know, okay. I know. But I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought I was helping. I thought the people I was working with, they had the answers. I was just trying to protect people. But it all went wrong. It's all gone wrong. Jason's mind raced as he processed Ryan's words. Was this genuine remorse, or was Ryan just trying to cover his tracks? Could he even believe what the officer was telling him? Where are you? Jason asked, his voice low, his body tense. We need to talk. There was a brief pause, and then Ryan's voice came through again, more urgent now. Meet me at the old warehouse on West 12th Street. 10 minutes. I'll explain everything. But you have to hurry. They're watching me, Jason. They'll know if I don't show up. Jason didn't hesitate. He grabbed his keys, slamming them into the ignition of his car without thinking twice. The warehouse on West 12th Street was a known location, one that had long been abandoned, a relic of a time when the city's industrial sector had been booming. It was the perfect place for a secret meeting, a place where no one would expect them to be. But it was also dangerous. Jason knew that. The officer had already betrayed the trust of the department. Who else was involved in this? The drive felt like it took forever, the seconds dragging as he sped through the empty streets, weaving through intersections and cutting across alleys. His hands gripped the wheel, knuckles white with tension. What would he find when he got there? What kind of person was Ryan really? When he finally arrived at the warehouse, the place was quiet. Too quiet. There were no cars in sight, no signs of life. The building loomed ahead of him, its dark windows like empty eyes watching his every move. Jason stepped out of his car, scanning the area carefully, his senses on high alert. He could feel the weight of the night pressing down on him, a sense of foreboding that made his skin crawl. He stepped cautiously toward the entrance, the creak of the old metal door the only sound that broke the silence. He pushed it open and stepped inside, his eyes adjusting to the dim light. There was no one there. At least, not at first. Jason took another step inside, the floor beneath him dusty and cracked. The air was thick with the smell of old wood and rust. And then he heard it, a sound from behind him. A rustling, followed by the soft shuffle of feet. Jason spun around, his heart racing. There, standing in the shadow of a metal beam, was Ryan. If you're still hanging on to every word, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. This story is heating up, and the twists are only getting more intense. Keep watching, because what happens next will change everything. Jason's heart hammered in his chest as his eyes locked onto Ryan's figure in the shadows. The officer was standing there, but his posture was different from when they had last spoken. His shoulders were slumped, and his face was etched with a tension that Jason had never seen before. The earlier flustered uncertainty had been replaced with something darker, a mix of guilt, fear, and maybe even desperation. For a moment, neither of them moved. The air between them was thick with unspoken words, each of them caught in a moment where the weight of what was happening seemed too much to bear. Finally, Ryan spoke, his voice low and rough. "I didn't want this to happen, Jason. I swear. But once you're in too deep, there's no way out." Jason took a careful step forward, his eyes scanning the room for anything unusual. The warehouse was mostly empty, save for a few scattered boxes and some old equipment. The dim light coming from the cracked windows cast long shadows across the walls, creating a sense of claustrophobia. There was nowhere to hide, nowhere to run. "Ryan," Jason said, his voice steady but his mind racing. "You're telling me you didn't know what you were doing? You didn't know you were leaking information, putting lives at risk?" Ryan's eyes darted around the room, avoiding Jason's gaze. "At first, no. I didn't know. But they got to me, Jason. They made it sound like the right thing. They told me I could help people, protect them from the corruption. I thought it was for the greater good. But now I see how wrong I was. I can't undo it. I can't change it." Jason's stomach twisted. He had seen this before, the rationalization, the self-justification. People like Ryan didn't just fall into this kind of mess without someone pulling the strings. "Who, Ryan?" Jason asked, his voice a little more forceful now. "Who made you do this? Who's behind it all?" Ryan looked around the room again, as if the walls themselves were closing in on him. He stepped forward slowly, his eyes meeting Jason's for the first time in what felt like hours. It's higher up than you think. I didn't know who I was working for, not really. But the more I leaked, the more I learned. The more I realized that I wasn't helping anyone. I was feeding the fire." Jason's mind was spinning. The deeper this went, the more entangled Ryan seemed to be in a web of lies, deceit, and corruption. But there was still a part of him, deep down, that wanted to believe Ryan. Could someone like him, someone so visibly conflicted, really be the mastermind behind something so insidious? "I know you're scared," Jason said softly, his voice calming. "But you need to tell me everything. This is bigger than you now. You've got to help me take it down, Ryan. You don't have a choice anymore." Ryan's face crumpled, and for a brief moment, Jason saw something almost human in him, a flicker of the officer he had once been, someone who had believed in justice, in doing the right thing. But that was all fading now, replaced by the terror of what he had become a part of. "They'll kill me, Jason," Ryan whispered, his voice trembling. "They'll kill me if I talk. I've already said too much. If they know I've reached out to you, they'll come after me." Jason took another step forward, his jaw clenched. "Who's they, Ryan? Who are you afraid of?" Ryan's eyes locked onto Jason's, his breath quickening. "The higher-ups. People who control everything. They've got connections everywhere, inside the department, outside. The leaks go straight to the top. People who have the power to make things disappear, to erase anyone who gets in their way. I didn't even know how deep it went until it was too late. I was just a small part of something massive. I never thought it would go this far." Jason's heart raced. If what Ryan was saying was true, then everything had just changed. This wasn't just a case of a few bad apples. This was an entire network of corruption, and it reached all the way to the top. The stakes were higher than Jason had imagined. And now, everything was personal. "Who's at the top?" Jason asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Who's pulling the strings?" Ryan took a step back, his eyes wild with fear. "I can't, Jason, I can't say their names. They'll find me, they'll find both of us. But I've got to get out. I need protection. I need you to help me. They've got eyes everywhere. You don't know what they're capable of." Jason's mind was spinning, the weight of Ryan's words pressing down on him like a vice. He didn't have much time. If Ryan was telling the truth, then they were both in danger. But there was no turning back now. This wasn't just about one officer or one leak anymore. It was about exposing a system of corruption that had taken root deep within the department, a system that Jason now had to dismantle piece by piece. "I'll help you," Jason said, his voice unwavering. "But you've got to trust me. You've got to give me everything. Names. Dates. Anything you have. We can't do this without all the pieces." Ryan looked at him, his face pale, his eyes wide with desperation. "I'll give you everything. But you've got to get me out of here. They'll come for me. They'll come for us both." Jason nodded, his jaw tight with determination. He couldn't afford to make mistakes. He couldn't afford to hesitate. The road ahead was dangerous, far more dangerous than anything he had ever faced before. But he knew one thing for certain, he couldn't walk away now. "We'll figure this out," Jason said, his voice steady. "But we have to move fast." Ryan swallowed hard, his eyes filled with uncertainty. "Where do we go now?" Jason's gaze drifted to the door, his mind already racing with plans. "We get you out of here, and then we take this to the right people. We expose everything. This ends tonight, Ryan. No more lies. No more corruption." But as he turned to leave the warehouse, Jason couldn't shake the feeling that they were already too late. The system they were up against was vast, and there were too many people willing to protect it, too many people willing to kill to keep it intact. As they stepped into the darkness of the night, Jason knew one thing: this was only the beginning. And the road ahead would be paved with danger, betrayal, and choices that would challenge everything he believed about justice. If you're still hooked on this intense ride, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. This story is far from over, and the twists are just getting started. Stay tuned for more revelations.